circumstances or the current situation. So we are probably looking at a new type of a presidential runner. He is not following the typical footsteps of any presidential campaign.
This is not a typical election, and as you lined that, and again I repeat that 2012 was a typical election where you had 13 candidates, you had a lot of fragmentation, only few people choosing the best candidate, only a quarter of the voters choosing Shafi, and quarter also choosing, which means 75% of the voters rejected, at least 75% rejected all candidates. So that's a typical election. This is not a typical election, it's far from it. This is, as you said, this is a moment where Egyptians felt there was an existential threat threatening their country, and they wanted to save the country from collapsing. And we have seen around us in Libya, and even worse in Syria and Iraq. We see now in places like Nigeria, we see it in Somalia, we see it in Afghanistan, we see it in places where...
Somalia, Boko Haram have abducted
Boko Haram in Nigeria. So we have seen a lot of people take the idea of the state for granted. So they are reckless about what they do and what the effect on the state. Egyptians in 2012 and 2013 realized that their state was in danger, and this could actually cause a disaster, humanitarian disaster. Millions of people could die if the Egyptian state collapsed. This is a fact. I mean, look at Syria and compare it to the situation in Egypt. You can make a very easy simulator. You can realize that if Egyptian state actually collapsed, we're talking of a humanitarian disaster of unprecedented proportions. So Egyptians decided to abort this. And when they decided to abort this, the moment that they saw in General Sisi at that time and in the army supporting for their plea, they gave him the trust, and then in fact he announced that he was not going to run, and a lot of people at that time thought that this was a good idea. But then it became very clear that Egyptians were going to force him to run one way or another. So, or a lot of Egyptians, I'm not saying all Egyptians, but I'm saying a big portion, a big chunk of Egyptians. So this is not a time for campaigning or for talking about elections or whatever. We need to save the state first, and then we can do other things later. That's the way Egyptians usually think. Whenever there is a danger, let's fix this now, and later we can have all
started something, but then complete
all fancy ideas about democratic elections and so on. So this is not a typical election. What we see somebody who was literally pushed into
he didn't have much choice.
He didn't have much choice. Remember, a lot of people had previously accused the Sisi of being Ikhwan, of being a Muslim brother, because for 1 year he was doing, people were pushing him, what's going on, we have to do it. And a lot of people were accusing him of being Muslim brothers because he tried to fix things, he tried to get people into political parties into dialogue and so on. So he was literally at the end pushed into this position. Now, the first thing that we realize, again, I disagree that this is an election about program. This typical election is about program and so on. This is an election is about character. It's about character, and it's about popularity, it's about trust, it's about confidence. I see that a lot of people, as Dr. Emad explained, a lot of people are trusting the other candidates, Sabahi, especially some of the youth, some of the revolutionaries, etc. Fine. Many Egyptians, on the other hand, if we look at Basira opinion poll, many Egyptians, more than about, if the numbers are correct, about 72% of those casted, 2005 people casted, supported Field Marshal, retired Field Marshal.
Which also reflects the priorities of Egyptians.
It reflects the urgency of the situation. This is not about elections. This is about a moment of danger, and we have to stand up. And this is not my opinion, by the way. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible because I go out and have to analyze what each candidate is doing. But what I'm describing, what I'm reading, what I'm seeing in the street, what I'm seeing in the in average Egyptian, what I'm seeing in the opinion polls. So this is not about programs. This is about character. This is about ability. This is about proven experience in management, in delivering results, in being able to deliver results even in hard conditions. And I think that's what attracted many Egyptians most to
Right.
to Sisi. Just one more sentence. What attracted a lot of Egyptians to Sabahi is the idea, it's also a very valid point, is the idea that Sabahi may be a better candidate to be able to affect the conciliation. And this is a very also respected view. That they see, okay, General Sisi at the time when he was general, he sided with the people, Muslim brothers. They say, oh, he sided with a fraction of the people, or was a part of the people. So a lot of people say, okay, but then Sisi is not the right president to affect reconciliation. And without reconciliation, we'll continue to have breach of security, and we'll never be able to deliver an economy. So
right. I'm very grateful to you because you brought me to a very important issue, because my second question was going to be about Sabahi's stance and Sabahi's vision, but we have to be tackling handling this question first, because when we talk about that period or that stage of time when Field Marshal back then Sisi was handling terrorism in Egypt, and maybe international media and the Western world didn't see it that way. Maybe some human rights organizations didn't see it that way, and that's why they are siding with one candidate to another. So, but the question that raises itself, my question to you now, your own assessment of democracy and human rights. We are the Egyptians who are founding our own democracy and our own human rights. Are we supposed to found a democracy that is fit for Egypt, or that would please the West? Are we supposed to found human rights standards that is fit for Egyptians, or that is important from the US and the European Union? And what are the benefits for Egyptians to bring down a whole nation, bring down all its institutions, and try to found democracy from scratch? If you can elaborate on that.
There is no a standard definition of democracy or a standard form or a structure of democracy. Unfortunately, Egypt, as Dr. Nawara said, over the last 60 years, we've really never experienced democracy. So we don't have an Egyptian model of democracy. We don't have an Arab model of democracy. We don't have a Middle East model of democracy. So what is being happening at the moment, we're trying to import structures and shapes of democracy, and in a lot of ways it doesn't really fit our society. It doesn't shape our future as Egyptians, as Arab, as Muslims, as Christians. So unfortunately, we're going to have to take it step by step and reform it the way, or shape it the way it suits us. Again, the problem here is we're probably going to have to delay democracy a bit until we sort out national security, because national security has been breached. At the moment, I don't think there would be any conciliation with the Muslim Brotherhood, because terrorism is continuing, and my expectation is it will continue. So really the Egyptians are going behind Marshal Sisi, and pushing him is really to continue fighting terrorism and really bring Egypt back to safety.
So in this case, reconciliation does not fit with our own Egyptian democracy and our own human rights.
At all.
When we disagree with the democracy of the US and the human rights standards of the US,
United States doesn't have democracy.
Make of us
the United States
criminals.
doesn't have democracy, because there is rules and regulations. In the United States, you can never attack in media or in newspaper, attack the defense minister. It never happens. United States, and we've seen in the scenes of Wall Street, when people really were striking and protesting and blocking roads, they were physically thrown out. So they come to implement their concept or their approach or their impression about democracy on us. We are totally different societies. We've got our religions that set models and morals for us to follow. So we can't really rely on what the Human Rights Watch or Human Rights organizations say. Where the Human Rights Organization have been when the soldiers were killed in Rafah many times. Where the human rights been when Egypt was almost going into a civil war in 2012. They constantly highlight the negative points without trying to understand how the Egyptians behave and how the Egyptians live and how the Egyptians really basically want their country to be. We cannot follow what they're saying because it doesn't suit us. So going back to democracy, we have to implement our own model of democracy and taking into account our religions, taking into account our culture, and taking into account our behaviors and how we live. Things will get worse before they get better. It's a fact. So unfortunately, we're going to have to keep going down until a point where we realize enough is enough, and now we're going to have to start a new era where Egyptians are really shaping their own future and building their own country. And as Dr.